Welcome everyone to the ExLing conference. This is session 7 and we're starting off with Ted, who's reading the Keynote lecture 4. Thank you.
Okay, well, I welcome once more Ted Gibson or Edward Gibson from MIT. Ted has been with us and we will continue our discussion. Well, today, among other things, it is about syntactic islands, and I would very much like to hear about this, but because as in phonetics, we have some anchoring points. Well, I mean to say, stressed syllables, they gather around the unstressed ones, or enclitics and proclitics and so forth, in a prosodic way. Maybe in syntax we do comparable things. And looking at Ted's type, I just thought like this. As we do in phonetics, I mean, we have small, simple thing like phonemes, if we accept this terminology, which are combined in different ways in different languages, and we are setting up the phonotax, that is the way phonemes are combined. I mean to say, the human beings are clever and they exploit everything. I mean, why don't we use more or less the same mechanisms like phonotactics as in syntax tactics, and in other compounds as well? I mean to say, we may have some common mechanisms to organize different units. Once again, we will have the pleasure to listen to what Ted has to say, and at the end, we will discuss and put question. So please, Ted, go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much, Antonis, for inviting me to your conference. And I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'm delighted to be here over Zoom. And is it my understanding that you want me to talk for about 30 minutes? Is that okay? Is that about right?
It's around, no, 40.
Well, 40 includes questions. Is that right? Or yes. Do you want me to?
You talk 30 minutes and then
okay.
plus 10. But if you take more, I know you will take more. So
no, I'm pretty organized. So I can talk.
We are flexible. We are flexible. Don't worry.
All right, well.
Don't look at the clock or anything. Just talk.
That's just terrible advice to an academic. I think. Anyways, you should never say. But anyways, I'm gonna talk for just around 30 minutes because that's what you told me. And so I'm gonna try to keep to that clock. Anyway, I'm gonna share my screen now, and I'm gonna be talking about syntax, as Antonis mentioned. I'll just tell you a little bit about me and what I do a little bit in case we don't know each other. Oh, okay. So this talk is about syntactic so-called island effects. If you don't know what those are, it's an old question in the syntax literature, but I'll tell you what that is. Okay. More broadly, I'm interested in how humans produce and comprehend language, mostly morphemes, words, and compositional rules of language, as opposed to the sound level, which I guess Antonis is more interested in. I'm also interested in the sound level, but I spend most of my time on meaning side, so the morphemes, words, and compositional rules, and how understanding language processing and acquisition might give insights into why language looks the way it does. And towards that end, my collaborators and I have looked at the structures of words and sentences across many, many languages to look for generalizations, and we've actually found many such generalizations. And you can see a recent article summarizing some of my and other labs results in that area in Trends in Cognitive Science, the Journal of Trends in Cognitive Science from 2019. But today, I'm going to talk about something a little more, a little more narrow, a little bit narrower topic. I want to probe the claim from the Chomskyan generative syntax framework that the unacceptability of certain kinds of structures, so-called island structures, is evidence that constraints that apply to these structures must be innate. And I'm going to be probing that using a usage-based constructivist alternative framework, arguing against the need for these across construction constraints. And before we go anywhere, I want to acknowledge my four main collaborators on this work: Yingtong Liu, who is a graduate student in linguistics at Harvard, and Abeille is a professor of linguistics at University of Paris, Barbara Hemforth, who's a research scientist in linguistics at University of Paris, and Elodie Winckel, who was a student at University of Paris under Anne and Barbara when we were doing this work. And the five of us have a review article coming out soon in the annual review of linguistics, which I'll be sort of referencing here. The way this talk is structured is partly based on that. Here's what I want to cover today. It seems like a lot. I'm just going to let you look at this quickly, and I'll bring it back when I do topic transitions. But briefly, I'm going to be describing the constraint-based approach to syntax, which has made island structures central to their program, the Chomskyan program, because of the need to have them as an innate part of universal grammar. Then I'm going to present a rough alternative without these high-level constraints. And this alternative is arguably learnable. And I'm going to present data that's difficult for the original conception of the constraint-based approach to handle and make sense, but they make sense perfectly in the usage-based or construction-based setting. Okay, so here's the context. As you're probably familiar, a dominant theory of language is Chomsky's syntax-based approach. Chomsky's generative grammar starts with two general kinds of rules: merge locally and move anywhere. And then there are constraints on the movement. And universal grammar, or UG, consists of universal constraints, possibly parameterized, which block movement in some ways. There's probably other parts of UG, but this is some component of our UG here, such as what subjacency and barriers proposals, which I'll discuss briefly below. And of course, I should be kept in mind here that this part of the Chomskyan program is a bit Anglo-centric, English-centric. It's not evaluated on a wide range of languages. It's mostly evaluated on English and related languages. I just mentioned the Anglo-centricity here of this program because it was originally couched in terms of universal grammar. Chomsky is always making this pitch for UG universal grammar, which suggests that it applies to all languages. So it's kind of a little bit strange that it's mostly being evaluated on a very small number of languages. Other frameworks at the time were also Anglo-centric in many ways, but they weren't making the bold claim about being universal in some sense. So here my background is a little bit relevant for why I started on this program. I was trained as a computational linguist. I moved to in Carnegie Mellon University, and I moved into psycholinguistics early in my career. And I learned Chomskyan grammar among other alternatives like HPSG, GPSG, LFG, categorical grammar in the 80s. And I was always very interested in its claims and predictions. And this was especially relevant to me given my location. I'm at MIT. I've been at MIT since 1993 in the Brain and Cognitive Science department. And I had a joint appointment in linguistics for many years, from 1997 until 2014. The focus of this presentation is on these so-called island structures, which are unacceptable long-distance filler gap dependency structures, which were first noticed by Hodge Ross in 1967, but he didn't make much of them theoretically. Chomsky and his colleagues took island structures to be evidence for innate constraints on filler gap or movements here. So here's two examples. The first shows that extractions from parts of subjects aren't very acceptable. So who did stories about terrified John? That's an example from Chomsky. It's not very good. I agree with the judgment perfectly. And here's an extraction from part of a noun phrase, which also doesn't sound good, not very acceptable. Who did you hear the statement that the CEO promoted? Also not very good. And these are things you might want to ask, but these are not possible ways to ask those kinds of questions. So, and that's like why, so critically for the constraint-based claim, it is the form of these questions that makes island materials or other kinds of materials unacceptable, not the meaning. So they're unacceptable across, not just in questions, WH questions, but across other constructions which use filler gap dependencies, such as relative clauses, clefts, topicalizations, a whole bunch of those kinds of constructions that are present in English. So we have a parallel unacceptable subject island in a relative clause. I met the man whose stories about terrified John, also bad, and a parallel unacceptable complex NP island in a relative clause. I met the woman who I heard the statement that the CEO promoted. These are also bad. According to Chomsky's subjacency and barriers theories, as he's trying to explain why these things are bad, there are too many syntactic nodes of some specific type in between the WH phrase and its displaced position. This is basically too far. Who is too far from this thing, either in the relative clause or in the WH in the WH question, or in subject islands as well. This who is kind of too far structurally. Who is too far from this gap, the displaced position. There's too many, in particular, S and NP nodes in the subjacency theory between the gap and the WH phrase. The grammar allows connections crossing at most one of these nodes, but these sentences require movements crossing two or more, making them literally ungrammatical, not generated by the grammar. And so this is an old account that I'm talking about sort of two kinds of accounts here, subjacency and barriers. They're from the 1970s and 1980s. I talk about them because there's actually no recent account of one island in syntax that generalizes correctly to other island structures. And so this is, even though this is kind of the story for why these things are bad, this is actually the best kind of theory, which doesn't work very well, it turns out, when you look at examples. But I'm just gonna, a fascinating claim of this Chomskyan program was that these constraints on long distance dependencies were unlearnable, and therefore, well, they would be unlearnable if they really are part of the grammar, and therefore they must be innate. So either they're part of the grammar and they're unlearnable, they're innate, or there's some other way to deal with these because of the classic poverty of the stimulus argument. Since these constraints are purely structural, critically they hold across various constructions, not just WH questions, but also relative clauses, topicalizations, and clefts, all these things which have very different kinds of meanings. A child is unlikely to be exposed to the right input across all of these different constructions, so you couldn't learn that. You're only exposed to examples of acceptable ones, and there's no instruction or direct negative evidence for her to learn which of these dependencies are grammatical or ungrammatical acceptable. Okay, so it's unlearnable if this is a constraint across a framework, which is the claim here. Okay, so current work in Chomskyan syntactic sort of experimental approaches to the theoretical kinds of claims basically presume that some kind of a syntactic account must be correct. They actually don't give such an account, and they talk about sort of diagnostic experimental evidence for such kinds of for the role of syntax. So under this is John Sprouse and Colin Phillips's and their colleagues' work. They take a super additive interaction and acceptability judgments as being diagnostic of a syntactic island as follows. Okay, so here's the NP island case here. This is a bad sentence. Who did you hear the statement that the CEO promoted? And they do ratings. How good does this sound? Is people asking people, and it's rated very poor here. It's very, very, very low. And they have a bunch of controls where you have sort of similar length of dependency, but not as complicated. And they have short versions with simple and complicated structures. And all of those three kinds of constructions are rated much better. This one is rated much worse. That interaction, super additive interaction in badness, is something they take to be a diagnosis of bad of a syntactic explanation. Okay, that's how the reasoning goes in this framework. But the problem here is there's actually no working theory of syntax that explains the badness of these long distance dependencies. They just assume that it's probably syntax, but all you've got is a cute, like they do have an experiment. There's nice experiments here showing there's an interaction. There's something's really bad about this sentence, but you don't know what the source of that badness is. We have no prior reason to think the source for the superadditivity might be in syntax versus some other place, like memory limitations or discourse or meaning, just some other properties of the meaning, or something weirdness about this meaning. And so this is a fallacy of reasoning. You can't just show a superadditive interaction and conclude it's syntax. Superadditive interaction just means you don't know the source of the badness of this one sentence. That's what that means. Unless then you need some theory to show that and test that theory some other way. Okay. There have been many examples of islands that have been provided in the literature with researchers asking us to infer that the source of the superadditivity is syntax. My conjecture with my colleagues here, our conjecture is that most of these islands, almost every one of them, is probably explained by other factors. It's probably explained in terms of word frequency, lexical frequency, plausibility, meaning, incongruity to do with the discourse, and maybe, and sometimes interference having to do with memory limitations in some way, nesting complexity. We just think that the experiments mostly haven't been done right so far. They've just been confounded. And this is not, I mean, this is a specific way to say an old claim. Other people have made that kind of claim without saying it specifically about the experiments not being done right. This is just following other researchers listed who have suspected the same thing, going back to Nomi Ertush-Shir and people like Adele Goldberg, and Philip Hofmeister and Ivan Sog, and so on, of course, and us and Rui Chavez as well in these more recent times. Okay, the critical result in these experiments, or if there's just intuitions, if there's no experiment, is always an interaction. One, it's really hard to have an intuition about interaction, so you need to do the experiment. You can't just think there is an interaction, you have to run the experiment. And even if you have an interaction, you don't know why, when you find that interaction critically, you don't understand what the source of that interaction is. Okay, so we need to do the experiments, and then we need to try to understand what the confounds are, if there are confounds, to see what things are controlled, try to explain what those interactions are. Okay, so now let's move to the constructivist approach to language. That, I mean, it's very, very rough here, what I'm going to say here. In contrast to this constraint-based view, in a constructivist theory of language, we have morphemes and words, which are forms associated with minimal meaning units, and we have combinations, which are rules of compositionality, each with a form and a meaning. These are all constructions in Goldberg's terms. Critically, each of these is sensitive, very highly sensitive to frequency of use, for which now we have a lot of evidence in both the word level, and in the combination level. So this contrasts already with the Chomskyan view, which ignores use frequency. If use frequency is just not part of that framework, that framework focuses on possible versus impossible in some way or other. So focus suggests that there's some categorical boundaries in places which we have never seen evidence of. So back to the frequency thing, we can test that, and there's lots of evidence for that. It's very easy to find word frequency effects anywhere in any natural tasks. Here's a neat recent example of the brain's sensitivity to grammatical surprisal and n-gram surprisal, which n-gram surprisal is kind of a fancier, much fancier version than word frequency. It's like sequence frequency. This is from Corey Shane. He's the first author in a paper in Neuropsychologia and in Ev Fedorenko's lab, and they show very strong 5-gram and probabilistic context-free grammar surprisal responses in bold signal fluctuations in the language network of the brain for naturalistic audio materials. Just people listening to stories is all this is. Just stories of either real things that happened, or so it's kind of newspaper-ish kinds of things, or like actual fiction stories, okay, listening to a lot of these things. And so you get a lot of variability in sequence probability and in grammar probability. And so you get strong, it turns out strong, actually independent measures of how predictable a word is given the preceding context. Either the sequence of the 4 preceding words, which is just a fancy version of frequency, it's sequence frequency, which predicts the bold response, basically a brain response to that word, and you get an independent measure of the rule response, how of the syntactic context from the beginning of the sentence according to a probabilistic context-free grammar. The merge and constraint-based framework just don't predict any role for frequency, either lexical or syntactic frequency. So this is much more in line with the constructivist usage-based approach, I think, to start with. That's where I'm sort of starting from. And now I'm going to move on to specific examples of island phenomena which don't follow the Chomsky constraint-based view, and in many cases contradict its predictions directly. So I'm going to take you about 2 kinds of things here. The first one is about work that Yingtong Liu did, looking at so-called factive and manner of speaking islands, as in B and C. What did Linda know that Bill fixed? It's not very good. And what did Sally whisper that Tom threw? These aren't very good sentences. The 2 red ones aren't very good. This one's fine. What did Maria say that Frank bought? So say allows this kind of extraction. Know and whisper don't really like this long distance connection between what and the more embedded verb. And a question is, why is that? It's a long observation, it's been observed for a long time that changing that verb in between makes a big difference as to how good those extractions are, how good those long distance dependencies are. An old syntactic account of this unacceptability from factive questions suggests that there's a covert noun phrase following a factive verb corresponding to a word like fact. So, what did Lyndon know that Bill fixed is underlyingly something like what did Lyndon know the fact that Bill fixed. So the badness of those materials might collapse to be a complex noun phrase extraction. And a similar hypothesis was provided for manner of speaking verbs with an empty noun phrase headed by a noun-like sound. It's like an empty word like that here. So what did Sally whisper that Tom threw is underlyingly what did Sally whisper the sound that Tom threw, which isn't very good. And so maybe then barriers or subjacency can explain these. But first of all, you should note that there's no independent evidence for either of these claims. They're just proposed to account for these judgments to start with. So there's no actual reason to think that they're even true to start with. Let's test them anyway, ignoring the fact that they're not independently motivated. So here are the predictions of the syntactic approach to these kinds of islands along, there's also a semantic thing which is thrown in here, but I'll just ignore that for now. So this is the kind of a thing. So in acceptability, where goodness is up and bad is down here. So this is good, this is bad. For the declaratives, you should expect to be all close to ceiling. And then there should be some big acceptability difference for the WH questions. Here are the bridge ones. The baseline bridge ones should be good, and the factive and manner of speaking verb should be bad, resulting in these are all good, and this is really bad. That's an interaction of some kind, okay, between sentence type and verb type. Here's what you see. In fact, these are the result. These are like one way of graphing, some of the verbs from Yingtong Liu's recent experimental work. This appeared very recently in Cognition. First of all, there's a lot of variability in both the declaratives and the WH questions. They're not clumped like this. They're actually very similarly displaced in both of these clumps here. Okay. Second, there's a large overlap in the factive and bridges. Okay, so these things are the green ones are supposed to be way down here, but they're all intermixed with the red ones, contrary to prediction. And there's really just a continuum of rating in WH questions, and there's just no statistical interactions. So those things that are predicted are not there. To the extent that there is variability in WH questions, it's the same variability that's in the declaratives. To exactly the same extent. It just kind of looks like it's just higher up here, but that's a fact of the scale. This is being plotted on a linear scale where there's a ceiling here. It hits right here. The top is 5. That's as high as it can possibly go. When you analyze this as an ordinal regression or a logistic regression, the dots here are doing actually the same thing as these dots are doing over here. So a closer inspection then gives rise to a much simpler theory. It's just that the frequency of the verb frame, turns out that is predicting acceptability here along with sentence type. So this is building on an idea actually back to Eva Dabrowska in 2008. And so I've just regraphed the exact same data in terms of putting verb frame frequency on the x-axis and just the acceptance rate on the y. We see just basically 2 lines here. This is the WH questions. This is the declaratives. And so we see 2 strong main effects with no interaction whatsoever. So to the extent, so what does this mean? This means that what did Sally whisper that Tom threw? To the extent that that's bad, it's just a sum of the badness of the declarative, Sally whispered that Tom threw something, and the low frequency of whisper. As an S complement verb. It's just not a very frequent S complement verb. It's just those 2 things put together. Okay. We note here that most of the factive WH questions are actually very acceptable. So it's just no that's bad. Actually, that's given as the classic example, but it's really this is just a weird outlier. Really, the factives are mostly just totally fine, and this one may be bad because there's some pragmatic oddity of this question. When you say what did Lyndon know that Bill fixed? There's an easier way to ask the exact same question, which is what did Bill fix? If she knows it and that's all we're adding to the information, then you can just say what did Bill fix? That's a speculation. We don't have actual strong evidence for that. Because that's just about one verb here. I'm not going to focus on one verb when there's 24 verbs, I think, in this experiment. And we're explaining most of the variance, a lot of the variance here with just lexical frequency and the construction. In experiment 2 in Liu's work, There's 48 verbs. We see the same two strong effects, verb frequency and sentence type. Again, these two lines, and they're apart, right? So there's like some line going up here. Verb frequency is predicting the acceptability, and the badness is driven by, the WH questions worse than the declarative. There is no interaction again. These lines look like they're kind of going apart a bit. To the extent there is an interaction, it's actually in the opposite of the predicted direction by the syntactics in semantic theory. So it's totally not what's expected here. I think that's just noise. Furthermore, many of these verbs just unclassifiable in terms of factive versus manner of speaking. They're well predicted. Those verbs are well predicted by the lexical effect. And there was 2 further experiments in this work showing strong verb frame frequency effects predicting island strength in cleft structures instead. So in conclusion, on this first part, we failed to find evidence for interactions in the tested constructions contrary to the previous accounts. And we find strong evidence for the frequency account explaining acceptability variance in both filler gap constructions and declaratives formed by verbs beyond the 3 categories. So the factive and manner of speaking island structures appear to be fully explainable in terms of frequency of lexical and syntactic rules with no need for this unlearnable subjacency constraint. And if you're interested, this project actually started as an attempted replication of Ambridge and Goldberg 2008. And although we were actually very sympathetic to their backgroundedness approach to explain the island phenomena for this case, we don't think that it applies in these examples. We think something's much more like their approach can explain other kinds of island effects, but I'm not going to talk about that here. And so we think lexical and construction completely accounts for those. So next, the last section here of this talk, I spent a lot of time working with Abeille, Barbara Hemforth, and Elodie Winckel at the University of Paris, initially trying to understand subject islands, and more recently on many other kinds of constructions in English and French. And I'm going to start with subject islands. So consider these subject islands again as in 1A and 1B. Who did stories about? Terrified John. Or which sports car did the color of? Delight the baseball player. Clearly not good in English. Under the syntactic approach, the bad extractions out of subject position have nothing to do with the meanings of these things. Therefore, all extractions should be equally bad across constructions of different meanings. That's a critical prediction of this framework. But it turns out that there's many attested examples in normal use of extractions out of subjects. They're mostly prepositional phrases that come out of relative clauses, but that's not relevant to this approach. That shouldn't be possible, such as these in English. So I love this example, this punchy writing from Jane Austen. A letter of which every line was an insult. That's from Jane Austen. That's like from one of her novels. And I really think it's a lovely turn of phrase, but that is this of which here is pulling out of a part of a subject in this case. And that should not be possible under the syntactic approach. And it's not only possible, it's like this is Jane Austen's generating. And there's lots of other examples that Anne and my colleagues have been able to find in English and in French. They exist all the time, turns out. So we ran several experiments. These were reported in 2020 and in a different paper in Cognition, testing acceptability of extractions out of subjects. And we looked at both WH questions and relative clauses in both English and French. In WH questions, we see the normal island effect, such that the extracted subject version is much worse than the other 3 conditions. So this is the extraction out of subject. That's -1 z-score rating. That's really bad. That's really terrible. And then we have the extraction out of object. That's okay. So which sports car did the color of? Delight the baseball player? Terrible. Which sports car did the baseball player love the color of? Is fine. It's okay. And then we have 2 controls here, which are good. These are coordination controls, which are just like there's no extraction in those, and they're just there so you can see there's some interaction relative to some good things. There's also interactions relative to some bad things, some things which are clearly ungrammatical. But now we look at relative clauses. You don't see this pattern critically. Okay, there's no such difference in relative clauses for the kind of the same materials just turn into relative clauses. So here in the subject here, right, this is the comparable subject. This is no longer bad. It's pretty good. The scales aren't quite the same here. This is from -1 to 0.5. This is only, down to 0.5 here, -0.5. And so neither of these are really very bad. These are kind of very similar here. Actually, not quite as good, but But so what we see is no longer do we see this is much the worst of these four. In fact, the subject and the object extraction from those is kind of similar. Maybe it's a little better numerically, at least. I think it happened to be significant. I don't know if we have a theory about that for out of the subject than for out of the object. And we see something similar actually in French. These results run totally contrary to the syntactic view, right? Because the syntactic view says that the construction is irrelevant, and we see clearly this three-way interaction here. Whatever's going on here is totally different from what's going on here. In WH questions and relative clauses, the effects are categorically different. Something's happening differently here, and which suggests, for our purposes, that meaning matters. So that here in a WH question, I'm trying to get information from you. In a relative clause, I am actually adding information to the discourse, and sometimes and for a relative clause, it's like things that you and I are both supposed to know. Okay, so there's just different meanings is the idea here. So our approach, our hypothesis, is in the constructivist camp, use-based camp, where we refer to as the focused background conflict constraint. So a focused element shouldn't be part of an unfocused or a backgrounded constituent. That's our idea. I'm just going to work through that kind of quickly here, just to get the idea. Under this hypothesis, there's meanings for all rules. For any rules, there's always a form and a meaning associated with that rule or whatever, or word or whatever. So there's a meaning associated with WH question and relative clauses, and these meanings aren't controlled in the two experiments. In particular, the meaning of a WH question is a focus. So this is the WH question rule here in sort of GPSG or HPSG format, and the meaning of that is a focus. And that means that this sort of question mark X bit here is the part of the meaning of WH questions that the speaker wants to find that out from her interlocutor. That's the focus of the utterance. As for extraction from subjects, we run into a conflict. This is subjects over here, this NP-VP here, this NP here kind of is a subject. But this X here, this thing is the subject. This is the topic. It's like that's the meaning of that is going to be the topic. Topics are usually backgrounded. They're actually the opposite of the focus. So the domain of a focused element is determined by the phrase dominating that element. So trying to focus part of a subject results in trying to focus a backgrounded element, which is a conflict in what we think is innate social conventions. You can't focus part of, but you can't focus part of a backgrounded thing, which in this case the subject tends to be backgrounded. But focusing part of an object's okay because that's part of the typical focus of a sentence. And in relative clauses, there's some form here and a meaning associated with that. We just don't have a focal meaning in a relative clause. The meaning of a relative clause is to add this property P of X to the meaning of the head noun. We just don't have a conflict here. We're not trying to get that information from the listener. Okay, so in this story, the meaning of these constructions are learned from experience with them. So a baby or a kid or something, here's relative clauses, learns what a relative clause is. Here's WH question, learns what WH question is. Here's simple declaratives, learns what those things are. There's no learnability problem. It's a bottom-up learning problem for sure, but it's not. You don't run into this poverty to stimulus problem. We don't have a learning. We have to try to learn a constraint on an unbounded movement. We just don't think those are there. Okay, so according to this focused background conflict constraint, a focused element shouldn't be part of the unfocused backgrounded constituent. This constraint will allow this, which card did the baseball player like, or baseball player like the color of, because the focus domain for the focused element is in the focus of the clause. The focus domain for the focused element is determined by the phrase dominated position. So the object, the sentence object, the sentence subject, and the object of color are all in that domain. It's all fine. C and D are no good because the focus domain now for the focused element is the subject, which is backgrounded, and that's no good. F is fine because there's no focal meaning in a relative clause, and so extractions out of subjects should be okay. Okay, I'm running to the end here. We've run parallel experiments in English and French. I mentioned I'm not going to. Here's some French examples in case you happen to want to see some French examples. We get exactly this. We get parallel results in French. Extractions from parts of subjects in WH questions in French are no good. Extractions from parts of subjects in relative clauses are okay. And fascinatingly, Sprouse et al. Actually found exactly the same thing in Italian, but they didn't address the result theoretically. So we've got 3 languages which show the same kinds of results here. There's a bunch of things which follow from this. I'll just tell you a couple. So another interesting prediction that this hypothesis makes is the graded nature of felicity of extraction of noun complements depending on the definiteness of the embedded noun phrase. So this is a really old observation, which you may be familiar with. Which actress did you buy a picture of is okay, but which actress did you buy that picture of is not very good. This follows from the focus background conflict constraint because this thing is a focus, right? These are focus thing, and that's fine when this is still a focus position, which they are. But as soon as you make this a definite, you're turning it into a backgrounded thing. That's something we should know about. That's conflicting now. I can't really do that. It's worse. It should be worse. And fascinatingly, it predicts no contrast in relative clauses. So we should get differences depending on the construction. And that's actually the judgment in the literature. We actually have not gone and run these experiments, but we should. These are just standard judgments from the literature, which people didn't explain. So this is, that is the actress who I bought a picture of is fine. And that is the actress who I bought that picture of is also fine. It's just, so there's some like better, this is the judgment for the literature. I kind of get that, but I haven't run the experiment. And so again, there's no focus here, so we don't have this conflict. There's only a focus in WH questions. Fascinatingly, if you add a focus marker to those backgrounded things, you make them into a focus. So which car did the color of please the baseball player, not very good. But if you make which car did even the color of or only the color of please the baseball player, these things get way better. This is just what the focus background conflict predicts. Okay, I'm wrapping up now. I want to conclude, I want to return to the canonical island diagnostic from Sprouse and Phillips and colleague, as in this NP island case I brought up earlier, how finding such an interaction in acceptability ratings doesn't tell us what it comes from, okay? So they guessed that the likely source whenever you see this is syntax, but remember, they don't give a theory of syntax that does this, and they don't rule out other plausible alternatives. And you think I'm not, I'm not joking when I say they say this. Here's an example from Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips, 2012, in a paper in Language. It's a relatively recent published example of this fallacy. I'd say fallacy of argumentation. They test a resource theory of acceptability of island effects. That's fine, and they find no evidence for that resource theory. Then they then conclude, we believe that the results of the experiments presented in this article provide strong support for grammatical theories of island effects because we can find no evidence of a relationship between processing resource capacity and island effects. Okay, what they're saying there is they're trying to conclude from a null effect that they don't this theory they were testing did not predict it. Then they conclude that some other theory which they haven't given must be true. This just is a complete fallacy. So they haven't given a grammatical theory and they haven't tested that. They just rule. I think there's useful experiments in there. I'm not saying the experiments are no use. They do rule out a particular resource capacity theory, which doesn't explain these. That's useful, but then you can't conclude that it must be grammar underlying it. I'm almost done. Okay, so here I presented data that are difficult for the original conception of the constraint-based approach to handle, but which makes sense in a usage or construction-based setting. So that is that some islands are sensitive to lexical frequency. Subject and adjunct islands, I only told you about subject, I didn't tell you about adjunct ones. We have very similar results for adjunct islands. Acceptability varies depending on the construction. It's construction dependent, not purely syntactic. We get very similar results across languages, English and French, and then there's results from the literature in Italian. We conjecture that for other islands, the experiments just haven't been done right. They're just confounded. So maybe all are explained by lexicon, plausibility, discourse, and memory. And so the critical result, remember, is always an interaction. It's hard to have an intuition about an interaction. You have to do an experiment. But even if there is an interaction, you do the experiment doesn't tell you the source of the interaction. So in conclusion, I don't see any remaining motivation for the nativist approach for understanding these displacement phenomena. The data don't support such a claim, and the resulting theory without that hypothesis is much simpler with less innate structure proposed in language. So I want to acknowledge my wonderful collaborators and the National Science Foundation for funding this research. And I went 5 minutes longer, and I apologize for that. I'm going to blame myself for that. I could blame Antonis for taking as long as you want, but it's my own fault for listening. Are there questions?
If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. Thanks very much for that presentation.
I see.
Yeah, if
What
you
can
can
be
see
the
the chat.
Yeah. What can be the implications of considering word frequency to make transformers as Bert, Albert account for islands rather than considering word embeddings only? Okay. Well, that's a kind of a complicated question. So your question is kind of loaded in some way or other here, and I'm trying to trying to unpack it. Okay, so you want to use these transformer models. You want to look at transformer models like BERT and or various other ones, maybe GPT-2 and 3 and so on, to push them further here to see if they could maybe account for islands. I mean, so these models, right, GPT-2 and BERT and everything, are just exposed to massive amounts of data. They get way more data than a human ever runs into, and they make generalizations which may or may not correspond to what humans do. And so there's actually quite a bit of work in the last few years trying to understand what different versions of these kinds of models do for these complicated materials. And so I know like people out of Roger Levy's lab and Richard Futrell and a couple of others have tried to look to see, I think there's a guy at Yale, Bob Frank, who's been interested in this as well, as to how well these models predict, can explain, can account for these island effects. And I think there's just kind of a mixed bag right now. And I'm not, so sometimes they explain some things and they may explain some things and they may not explain others. So my guess is they might be best at explaining the, I mean, who knows? There might be enough data there to, potentially account for all of the island phenomena. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised eventually if they can account for all of the island phenomena. There's a lot of different island phenomena, right? So I sort of highlighted two different kinds, like these things. An island, a syntactic island, right, is just a bad long distance filler gap dependency in some language. That's what it is. And then what's the source of that? And so I gave you evidence from the first part from Ying-Tong Liu's work that in some of these cases they're driven by the verb, the frequency of the embedding verb is driving that. And I wouldn't be surprised if these models would be able to account for that and be able to like do similar kinds of, if you can do experimental judgments in some way similar, you probably get those. I don't know if they can. I haven't actually seen that work. I mean, I don't think people have taken my way of categorizing these things and tried to map it out into these different transformer models and see how they work. But I wouldn't be surprised that they did well in those cases. They may have a harder time with the cross construction differences. So WH questions versus relative clauses versus clefts and topicalization cases, where you just may not have as much data to learn from. That's what you need. You need data on those things in these models. You'll need enough examples to be able to make the right generalizations. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that they're worse at those ones, but I don't know. Just because I think the data is not going to be, it's going to be very sparse in naturalistic text. And so then that sort of rises. I don't know. It's like some people argue about this. Bob Frank and, as I mentioned, at Yale and Richard Futrell, I think, argue. I mean, what does it mean? I don't know what it means quite yet. So to the extent they do exactly the same thing, then there's going to be an inference that maybe they're doing it in the same way that humans do it. But we always have to keep in mind that the data that they're exposed to, these models, is so much more than any baby ever runs into, that they're maybe doing it in a fundamentally different way, right? Because babies don't run it. They don't have access to 10 to the 15th words. They have access to 10 to the 10 to the 7th or something, so not 8 orders of magnitude more to be trained on. And so there's maybe similarities, maybe differences, I guess, in the next. I think we'll probably know a lot more in the next 5 years. Actually, things are moving fast. So I hope I answered your question somehow. Can we go to, there's a hand raised here. Is that Antonis? I don't know who's which ExLing society that is. There's 2 of you.
That's Antonis, yeah.
Antonis, you want to go ahead? Because there you go.
Let me turn on. Okay. Well, Ted,